Professor Philip Stark is an internationally renowned statistician. He is Associate Dean of Mathematical and Physical Sciences at University of California, Berkeley. He is a proponent of evidence-based elections. He has devised what he calls a risk-limiting audit. If this is applied in Indian elections, it would arguably render the result more trustworthy. Let's listen to what he has to say. Professor Philip Stark, thank you very much for joining me. Right, so to move on to one of your papers, and let me quote what you said. Computers, including all modern voting systems, can be hacked and misprogrammed, unquote. Can you please elaborate on that?
The vast majority of computer hardware, commodity computers, there isn't really a way to verify what's inside. If you have an integrated circuit, you really don't know what other circuitry might be there aside from what was intended by the original designer, what was disclosed in drawings. There's really no way to know what software a device is running, and in general, there isn't really a way to know exactly what hardware is inside. And so things can be lurking either as a result of supply chain hacks, where actually as the device was being assembled, it contains circuitry or software that isn't supposed to, or accidental bugs and misconfiguration in everything ranging from the lowest level systems to the operating system to the application software that the device is supposed to be running. There's essentially no way to make sure that any of that is perfectly secure on an industrial scale. There are perhaps some exceptions in some military systems, but in general, it just isn't possible. As a result, there's no way to guarantee that the device is performing as it's intended to perform and not making mistakes or cheating in some way. And so if we want to conduct elections in such a way as to justify confidence in the electoral outcomes, we need to conduct elections in a way that we can double check whatever we've relied on computers to do, so that if the computers malfunctioned, if they were programmed incorrectly, we can still catch and correct the outcomes before they become official.
So if this hacking and misprogramming can take place, would it need to be done manually or physically, or can it be done wirelessly?
The hacking of voting systems, can that be done wirelessly?
Yes.
In many instances, it can, through a variety of mechanisms. In the US, at least, many voting systems have radios, either Wi-Fi or Bluetooth or cellular modems or something like that, which provide an entry point for bad actors to gain access to the system and alter the programming. In addition, voting systems, at least in the US, need to be configured before every election with details of that specific election. What contests are on the ballot, who are the candidates in the contests, how should the ballot be laid out on the page, and so on. And that also provides a vector through which malware can be injected into voting systems. Because even if the devices that are being used to capture voter intent are not connected to the internet, the devices that are used to program the memory cards that are then used to configure those devices very often are connected to the internet. Moreover, there was malware and viruses long before we had an internet, and there are noteworthy examples of systems that were intended to be completely secure being compromised despite having no direct internet connection. And the Stuxnet virus is an example of that.
Mm-hmm. So moving on, as you may have heard, there's increasing suspicion in India about the integrity of the voting system as it exists today. And Does what you're saying about modern voting systems being hackable and misprogrammable mean that electronic voting machines in India can be hacked and misprogrammed?
Yes, they certainly can, just like any other computerized system. And there have even been demonstration hacks of the EVMs by a number of researchers. One of them, someone from the US who was involved, was Alex Halderman. I can't actually recall the name of the Indian scientist who was involved in that demonstration hack as well.
Right. So that being the case, and obviously it goes without saying that reliable elections are the essence of democracy. And so elections, you've written in another instance, need to be, quote, evidence-based, unquote. In order to achieve that, and you've emphasized this, where electronic voting systems are involved, one needs to create a meaningful paper trail and then an audit. Does this apply to EVMs in India as well?
Yes. So I understand that as of a few years ago, a VVPAT has been added to the EVM so that there is some kind of a paper record, but there's still some shortcomings of that system. And I can give you a list based on my current understanding. First of all, the paper is not directly available to the voter. The voter doesn't get to hold it in his or her hand and decide whether or not to cast it. Rather, my understanding is that it's displayed in, behind a window and automatically deposited after a brief delay. So even if a voter looks at the paper and notices that it doesn't reflect their intended selections, they have no way to stop the vote from being cast, the erroneous vote from being cast. Second, because the voter's interaction with the EVM isn't supposed to be witnessed by any other person, there is no way that a voter can provide evidence that what was printed differed from the selection that was made on the device itself. So there's no way to catch the machine in the act of cheating or malfunctioning in order to say, wait a second, we need to start over and hold this election again. To the best of my understanding, there's also no dispute resolution mechanisms in place in India, so that even if a large number of voters complain that the paper record doesn't match the selection they made on the device, there's no way to separate the machine truly malfunctioning from the voters having made mistakes, from the voters crying wolf and simply maliciously trying to cast doubt on the outcome of the election. So all of those things are shortcomings of the trustworthiness of the paper trail when the paper trail is created. But then the paper trail needs to be taken care of securely and kept trustworthy throughout the canvass period and through the time that a manual audit examines at least a sample of the paper records to make sure that the results reported by the electronic voting machines match what a manual tabulation of the paper records would show. So there isn't my understanding is there aren't adequate safeguards in place to ensure that that paper record remains trustworthy, even if it were trustworthy in the first place at the time that it was created. And then finally, there is no provision that I'm aware of to manually inspect an adequately large random sample of the VVPATs to ensure that an accurate tabulation of the VVPATs would produce the same winners that the EVMs announced.
So in your remarkable work over the years, you have devised what you call a risk limiting audit. You write in this respect, there are two main RLA strategies, namely ballot level comparison and ballot polling. There are others, perhaps. Can you please explain to a layman like myself as to what this is all about.
Sure. So polling audits are a bit like exit polls or opinion polls. They basically involve taking a random sample of ballots and reading the ballots by hand to see what votes they contain. Or in the case of India, it will be looking at the VVPATs by hand and interpreting them manually. And if a sufficiently large sample of ballots shows a sufficiently large majority for the reported winner, that's strong evidence that there really are more votes for the reported winner than for anyone else. A comparison audit works differently. A comparison audit is more like examining someone's expense report, where someone hands in some paper receipts and hands in a little electronic calculation that says, here were my expenses and here's what they total. So a comparison audit would take that electronic expense report and first double check the sums. Do these reported expenses in fact add up to the total amount that was claimed? And then take a random sample of the lines in the expense report and double check them against the paper to make sure that the reported amounts agree with the paper documentation, and look for discrepancies between those. So that's the principle that's at play in a comparison audit. Comparison audits can be conducted at the level of individual ballots if the voting system reports how it interpreted individual ballots, so that human auditors can compare how the machines interpreted the vote to how humans reading the paper would interpret that very same vote, that very same ballot or transaction by the voter. More generally, in the United States, systems can't report data at that fine level of granularity, but you can still conduct a comparison audit at a larger level of aggregation. For example, look at subtotals that were reported by a particular voting machine, or look at subtotals that were reported for a particular polling place, and double check whether a manual retabulation of the votes cast in that physical location agrees with the electronically reported result for that physical location. In the case of EVMs and VVPATs in India, my understanding is that you typically are voting on only one issue. You're voting for your government, and because of that, it is relatively straightforward to sort the ballots to sort the VVPATs into stacks that are homogeneous. That this stack purports to contain only votes for one particular candidate, and this stack purports to contain only votes for some other candidate or some other party. And by sorting and stacking in that way, one can still conduct a comparison audit, even though the EVM system cannot match the paper to the electronics, because once you've sorted and stacked, that amounts to saying the interpretation of each of these pieces of paper should be the same.
So in other words, while there is a random audit in India, people think it's highly inadequate. But apart from that inadequate, shall we say, cross-checking, do you think the technology involved is inadequate? Or for that matter, is the voting machine going into VVPAT and then onto the hard disk is something which is a flaw? And how would you put it?
My understanding of the random audits that take place in India is that they're not designed to have a large probability of catching and correcting wrong electoral outcomes. In order to do that requires tuning the sample size to the margin. For example, the smaller the margin of victory, the less error it would take to have caused the apparent winner to have erroneously caused the apparent winner to have won when in fact the apparent winner did not win. Regarding the order of data flow from the EVM to the VVPAT to the hard drive, again, while that issue matters for a variety of technical reasons, because there is no way for a voter to sort of interrupt the deposit of the paper into the ballot box and say, wait a second, that's not what I meant. The machine changed my vote, or I made a mistake, I want to change my vote. There's still, the paper affords very little security. There's no way, there's not good reason to believe that the paper records actually reflect what the voters did or saw or intended.
That's very interesting. It seems to me, having read a couple of your papers, that your fundamental scientific position is, and I quote, paper ballots provide no assurance unless they accurately record the vote as the voter expresses, unquote. So what you're saying is the risk or shortcoming in the current voting system is a situation where there is no guarantee that the result is accurate.
That's based on my understanding of how the EVM and VVPAT system works. That's correct. There is no opportunity for a voter to catch and correct errors made by the machines, or indeed catch and correct errors made by the voter. Once the buttons are pushed, the rest happens automatically. The fact that the voter gets a glimpse of the VVPAT isn't enough to ensure that the VVPAT correctly reflects what the voter did.
Okay, so then to come back to your risk limiting audit, RLA, this is obviously dependent on a trustworthy paper trail. And that being the case, so how do you make the system trustworthy as opposed to what is being provided by this combination of the EVM and the VVPAT in India at the moment?
So I think a system where the vast majority of voters hand mark their ballots would eliminate the electronics that is currently between the voter and the paper record. So if instead there were a pre-printed ballot with the parties or candidate names on it, and the voter simply took a stamp and stamped the selection, the intended selection on that piece of paper, or filled in an oval, or any one of a number of methods, then at least electronics couldn't cause the paper trail to be different from what the voter did. So the paper trail itself would then not be hackable. Then if the tabulation were based on that paper trail, one could do a risk limit, and the paper trail were kept secure, then that paper trail could be used to audit the electronic tabulation manually. So a good system in the US is voters mark paper ballots by hand. Those ballots are then optically scanned and tabulated. The ballots are kept secure and manually audited using a random sample risk limiting audit to double check that the electronics tabulated the votes accurately enough to determine who actually won. That is, that the reported winners really did win. I understand that there are reasons for using EVMs coming from efficiency and so on, but once you've introduced electronics between the voter and the durable record of voter intent, you've introduced a security hole that I know of no way to plug.
So correct me if I'm wrong, what you're saying in simple terms is a parallel system be created where there is a reliable paper record alongside what is being recorded in a voting machine.
Yes, or alternatively, that you don't record things in a voting machine, you actually record things on paper and then use a machine to tabulate the paper, to read the marks on the paper and tabulate that. That would be a more secure system than recording things electronically and producing a paper receipt that might or might not reflect what the voter did or saw.
But in terms of efficiency and time consumption, would this be a problem in any way?
If the ballots are being tabulated by running them through a scanner, it shouldn't slow things down. I mean, scanners do have moving parts and they can break down and they require more power than an EVM does. I mean, there are going to be some logistical issues around doing things that way. Again, because in India, elections don't involve asking the electorate dozens and dozens of questions. In my jurisdiction, it's not rare that I'm asked to vote on more than 20 or 30 different issues. So that makes tabulating votes by hand a lot more complicated. But if you're basically tabulating a single contest or a couple of contests, even if the counting were done by hand in public view, using volunteers who sworn an oath, that would still be relatively efficient for elections like those in India. And indeed, there are many countries around the world that do count their ballots by hand. It's certainly doable. So one could really eliminate electronics from the recording of votes in the first place, largely. There may be people who require some kind of electronic accommodation because of a disability, of dexterity, vision, or something else. But one could eliminate electronics largely from the recording of the votes and largely from the tabulation of the votes. You would still need to use some electronics to aggregate the votes to produce the totals by election district, by jurisdiction.
So the physical counting that you're suggesting would really be to make doubly sure that what the record is saying is correct.
The physical counting could be, so there are two ideas. One would be do an initial count electronically and then double check that by a random manual audit to ensure that if the electronics didn't determine accurately who won, that gets caught and corrected before the result becomes legally binding. Another approach is to do the original tabulation by hand, because that original tabulation is not that complex, given the number of issues that Indian voters get to vote on. And indeed, as I said, many other countries do tabulate their votes by hand, much of Europe.
But in a country the size of India, with 900 million voters, I think the major concern is the time that would be spent counting votes. And therefore, what you are recommending, does this really minimize that, or does it make that a problem in the sense that you go back basically to hand counting as it used to be?
The absolute number of voters doesn't really matter, because the number of polling places and the number of election officials and whatnot scale with the number of voters. So it isn't as if one is counting 900 million votes in one central location using a staff of 6. It's a problem that you distribute across polling places and jurisdictions. It provides, doing the counting by hand provides an opportunity for public oversight of what's going on, which one hopes would instill more trust in the electoral outcomes. It is certainly more time consuming than just pushing a button at the end of the day and saying, please spit out the total. But the amount of time that's required can be made relatively short by having many people involved in the manual counting.
My understanding is that your formula means that you don't count every vote. You strategically count a certain number of votes and thereby determine to a degree of certainty that the result is correct.
Yes and no. So I'm not proposing that instead of ever counting all the votes, one only counts a sample of votes. Rather, one starts by attempting to count every vote, either electronically or by hand, and then strategically double checks by looking at a random sample. So in carpentry, people talk about the rule, measure twice, cut once. It's a similar thing here. Vote once, count a little more than once, and then certify once. So that little extra bit of counting to ensure that the quality control on the original count, that it was accurate enough to determine who actually won, needn't be expensive. When the margins are wide, the number of ballots one needs to inspect manually as part of this little bit of extra counting can be quite small.
So your solution has been published for some time. Has anybody from the Election Commission of India or the Indian government approached you to know more about what you're proposing?
No. I've been in touch with a few scientists from India over the years, but never any contact with the government or the Election Commission.
So what you're in essence saying is, if your formula is applied, whether it's in the United States or India or any other country, then this lends to a safer and more secure electoral process.
Unfortunately, the answer is maybe. And because of the limitations of EVMs and the fact that the current EVM plus VVPAT doesn't allow the voter the possibility of catching and correcting errors introduced to the paper record by the EVM, it's not clear what a risk limiting audit using the VVPATs would accomplish, because the VVPATs are not a trustworthy representation of what the voter did. If India wanted to improve the security of its elections, I think first and foremost, one would want to eliminate the electronics between the voter and the paper, and then insist that the paper be the ballot of record rather than the electronic. Then one needs to keep rigorous track of the paper, secure chain of custody, demonstrably secure chain of custody, ballot accounting, making sure that the number of people who came to cast ballots equals the number of ballots that were cast, and so on, these kinds of cross checks. And then in those circumstances, once you've created a trustworthy paper trail and curated it to ensure that it remains trustworthy, then a risk limiting audit can add confidence that whatever mechanism was used to tabulate the votes, whether they were originally tabulated by hand, originally tabulated electronically, that the announced winners really are consistent with what an accurate tabulation of that record would show.
In other words, what you're saying is that the current Indian voting system is flawed, and the Election Commission of India need to consider a new system.
Yes.
And that being the case, I do hope that the Election Commission of India give your recommendations due consideration. Thank you very much for joining me. It's been a great pleasure. And I do hope that your suggestions will be taken on board in the right spirit, so that there is a totally trustworthy election in India.
Thank you so much. It's my pleasure, and I'm grateful for your interest in the work.